Okay. So we've touched on this topic in the past, in passing, and I thought maybe, it's mitzvah shazman grama. We should go through it in a little more detail today. So I wanted to go through the entire some of the etymology of how the modern phenomenon of Mechiras Chometz, the way we know it today, in its ubiquitous form that just about everybody participates in, how that developed, where that stems from, and how it got to where to the exact format that it's in today. Now, there's many innovations and developments that contributed to the way Mechiras Chametz looks today. It's not something. Suffice to say that the Mechiras Chametz that we have is not something that you could open up a Gemara Psachim and see. It says exactly how we do it. So let's try to break it down piece by piece. Now, I want to open with a little historical vignette that the Chasam Sofer in Orach Chaim in Shuvah Kufid Gimel brings down. It's a bakanta little piece of information, and Divrei Chaim revisits it as well. I want to open with that, and we'll try to piece together the story. So the Chasam Sofer says as follows: V'inei b'hiyois adayin hagoyin meriner of Baruch Frankel Zatzal av bezdin dektil kadesh leipnik b'chaim chiyusei. He says during the lifetime of the Baruch Tam, who was the Rav in Leipnik, and a shaila arose as follows. He says, Ira Maisa, there was a story. Shehilshinu malshinim etel sari Medina de Marin, shehuda moichern chamtzam b'shtaris m'blish stempel chaysim akira. It came to the attention of the local, magistrate that the Jews are selling the chametz without the stamp of the emperor, meaning they're avoiding taxes. They're not paying a transfer tax. They're not logging this in as a regular sale. When it came in front of the ruler, Amar Hadavar Yedua She'enze Masamatan Shel Tager Elinian Das religion. He spells out here. Alkein Enze B'chiv Shtampel Vayideza Noilad. So this he says it came to the ruler, and the ruler said, please, this is not something that requires a transfer tax. This is not an actual authentic sale. This is just some sort of religious finessing that's happening to absolve the Jews of their obligations in regard to the chametz. And it's not an actual sale that requires, valid government, signatories and taxes to be paid. Now, he says, the Baruch Tam had a big conundrum now. The mashma, the medina de malchus apostle ashdaruhu. The way the Baruch Tam understood the story is that vice dois, the medina de malchus adina, this is not a valid shtar. This is a shtar apostle. And Mameli wants to know, how is this considered a good bechira? Now, what the Baruch Tam is addressing, and what many poskim out there is addressed, is the haramadika aspect, meaning the very light, light and seemingly ineffective nature of Mechiras Chametz that makes it seem like a harama, and why that's valid, or should that be valid, and how that works. So now, I want to go back to the beginning of the story, where this all starts from. And this is Tosefta. The Tosefta in Psachim says as follows. It says, the Tosefta says, Yisrael v'Nachri, Shahayu B'Sfina, they were traveling in a boat. The Chometz biyad Yisrael, and the Chometz was in the hand of the Yisrael. Harehu Meichel and Nachri, could sell it to the guy. Ay noisnoi loy b'matana, give it to matana. V'chayzer v'leikeach men al-achar Pesach, and then he could go back and take it from him after Pesach. B'vad sheyitnu loy b'matana gemura, provided that he gives it to him matana gemura. V'rashay Yisrael sheyem l'Nachri, Yisrael could tell the Nachri ad she'ata leikeach b'mana kach b'masayim shem etztarach v'ekich m'cha achar Pesach. And the Yid could say, he could up the price to give the guy the impression that he's going to buy it back after Pesach. Meaning, so the Tosefta is the first one to bring down, and this is in a Yerushalmi brought down slightly differently, is the first one to bring down this yisoid, so to speak, this version, that there exists a mechira that is kind of a mechira that's not intended to be l'chalut, and it's not a mechira that's intended to go forever, and the guy may be somewhat aware of that in Afal Pikein, it's considered, a mechir of sorts. So this is the Tosefta in the second parak of Psachim in Halacha Vav. Now, the Tosefta, if you look at the words, the Tosefta seems to be talking about some sort of shasat chak, right? A person's on a boat, he's traveling, he doesn't have access, he doesn't know what to do about it. So what should he do? So he has some sort of, stopgap measure that he could do is to sell it. And because of this, in the Chuvas Hagayim it's brought down, it says V'amar of Amram, Yisrael shemachar chemtze l'gay, Yisrael who sold his chametz l'gay, Oishen nasan le b'matana gemura ve'en Yisrael ragal lasses kem b'shar shanim. Say that's a diak, and Yisrael does not normally do this. Elam me'ura haisa. It was something that happened, it transpired. Mutal Yisrael lachas v'likach men alachar Pesach. Yisrael could go back and claim his chametz on the guy after Pesach. Why? The kivin the kanya guy have le b'shusa v'kaim alon chametz shal guy mutar b'hana. It belonged to the guy. So Rav Amram seems to be saying that this din, that that we're learning from the Tosefta and from the Yerushalmi that a person could sell his chametz to go and get it back after Pesach is only provided it's some sort of coincidental occurrence. It's not something that he planned. It's not something he does with regularity, because if he does it with regularity, it's problematic. Now the truth is, there's a girsa that some Rishonim had. The Ritva seems to have this girsa, and that says in the Tosefta that it ends off with the Tosefta. He's allowed to do this. Bulvad shelo ya'arim, provided that he doesn't do any trickery. This is the girsa that the Ritva has. The Ritva in the beginning of the second paragraph Psachim, he has as follows. He says he brings the Tosefta and he brings these words. Bulvad shelo ya'arim. Avalim Herem, says the Ritva, who ragul laskem b'chol shan. He's ragul do this every year. Limka the goy kedem Pesach lit lachar Pesach, to give it to a guy before Pesach, to sell it to a guy before Pesach, and then to buy it back from after Pesach. Kansinan le v'asa lo l'chol leachar Pesach. It's also to him and everybody else for after the Pesach. Sha'aso ki'ilu chametz Yisrael hamufkad b'rshus goy. Chazal treated as if it's the chametz of a Jew that was just mufkad, not actually sold, but was just in the residence of a guy over Yom Tov, which is also after Pesach. And this Jew who's selling his chametz with regularity to a guy, he's always doing this. This is his arrangement. He never really intends. There's no Mechiras das to actually be making it to the guy. There's no Mechiras das, and the guys have to buy it. And it's really just the guy's just a host. The guy's just a warehouse. Al sheherim v'cheinu b'yushalmi. As the Ritva. The Ritva seems to be saying clearly, and the chidushim for the Talmud, the Ramban, and the Muki Yosef, and the Meiri, and other Rishonim seem to learn this way, that if a person is doing this with too much regilos, and it's a setup that he does every year, then this goes into what the Yerushalmi is talking about when it says Bulvad shelo ya'arim. This is the Girs in the Yerushalmi that some Rishonim in the Tosefta that some Rishonim had, and this it seems to be or around Ramgoyin and what some of the Gedolei Rishonim held. Now, l'chayra, if that's the case, that's very problematic for us, because our Mechiras Chometz that we do today certainly would fit into the cross section of what the Ritva is describing, of somebody who does this every single year, and l'chayra, it's squarely in the cross section of Bulvad shelo ya'arim. This is clearly a haram and Mechiras that we're doing to avoid having chametz in our possession. Now, so how do we resolve this? So the Beis Yosef in Siman Taf Mem Ches, he brings a Rabbeinu Yerucham as follows. And I want to read you what Rabbeinu Yerucham says. Rabbeinu Yerucham says like this. Kasav, Rabbeinu Yerucham wrote, this I'm reading of Beis Yosef, the Rabbeinu Yerucham Kasav, al Tosefta zu b'shem Bahag. Rabbeinu Yerucham writes in this Tosefta b'shem Bahag, u'b'vad shelo ya'arim, ve'eni meven dvarav. Da'ashari litnei l'goy b'matana v'lachzor l'chei achar Pesach. Ve'en l'cha harama gedolah mizu. You're allowed to give it to the guy b'matana and take it back after Pesach. There's no bigger haram in the world like that. V'afilu hachi shari ma'ach shemetziyim rishusay l'gamri. And l'maisa it still works because you're being metziyim rishusay. And the din is that you're not have chametz b'rshoscha, and you don't have chametz b'rshoscha. The efshir zakter Rabbeinu Yerucham the shelo ya'arim the ka'amar hainu lemer shelo yimkor loy v'leyitin loy al t'nai. Don't give it or sell it to him al t'nai, meaning make it be a mechira l'chalutin, a proper mechira, meaning, and he's teaching shelo ya'arim means make sure that the sale or the transfer is authentic and effective. Don't be ma'arim in the sale or in the transfer itself. It has to be that the transfer or the sale is itself effective. Now this is the Beis Yosef is bringing from Rabbeinu Yerucham, which opens up a new Havana in this Tosefta, and therefore a new ability which we all avail ourselves of selling chametz on a regular basis. Now the Chometz Hadashen in Chelik Aleph and Siman Kuf Chaf, Chometz Hadashen has a shayla as follows. He says, Misha yesh biyadai in yanei chametz samach lePesach, someone who has in his possession items of chametz close to Pesach, v'kasha lav levarim, and it's hard for him to devour them. V'roitze l'sittam l'nachri chutz lebeisai matanig mura. He wants to give it to a guy outside of his house, matanig mura. V'oisei nachri yisrael makira v'yedei abay shel yiga ben klal. This guy, the Jew, is familiar with him, and he knows that this non-Jew will return the chametz to him after Pesach. El yishmerim le'ad lachar Pesach v'yachz v'yitin lo shari kagav noiloi. So the Chometz Hadashen wants to know, and the Chometz Hadashen is essentially asking our very common form of mechiras chametz. You have chametz, you have no intention of actually losing this chametz. You want to place it under the auspices of a non-Jew so that he could, vishomer it for you over Pesach, and you fully expect that he's going to return it to you when Pesach is over. Is that allowed or is not? The Chometz Hadashen says Yira the Shari. Actually, the Chometz Hadashen says l'chayra it's mutter, as long as you make sure that you're going to give it in b'leishim tonight, which is like the Rabbeinu Yerucham. V'rayim miparik beis de gittin. To which the Chometz Hadashen goes and brings a few rayas, and then he ends up saying that and therefore the Jewish legend says, provided that you do a proper mechira, an actual mechira, and there is no haram in the mechira, or there is no haram in the matana, even though you know good and well that the person is going to return the chametz to you, and that is the entire plan, that's considered that circumvents the concern that the Tosefta raises, and you're allowed to transfer the chametz this way. And Mela in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Taf Mem Ches, the Shulchan Aruch writes, and I'll read you the exact sif. The Shulchan Aruch writes it says as follows in Taf Mem Ches in Sif Gimel, I believe. In Sif Gimel it says Chametz she Yisrael she'avar leVaPesach aser b'hanas, says the Mechaber. Afilu hinicha shoygeg yanus ve'machar yinas l'nei Yehudi. But if you sold it or gave it to any Yehudi, shemichutz l'bayis kaydem Pesach, who is not in your house kaydem Pesach, afal pi, even though sheyachzer v'yitnanale, he's going to return it to you mutter, b'vad sheyitnale matana gemura b'lishum t'nai, provided that you give him matana gemura b'lishum t'nai, which is essentially paraphrasing what the Rabbeinu Yerucham says and what the Chometz Hadeshin says, and not like a Rambam Goyin in the Ritva. And this is the first plank of allowing for a Mechiras Chametz. Now, the Noisei Kalim over here, the Shari Tshuva has a big arichas, and the Noisei Kalim arichas is an ayin sham. But the first thing to note over here is that the Mechira that's being described, based on this Tosefta, that's being codified in the Shulchan Aruch, and that's being paskin that the Bavad Shalei Aram is Rabbeinu Yerucham's version, is still only referring to a single individual who has chametz, who's making a transaction with a non-Jewish person that he knows, and he's actually doing an authentic sale, like the Shulchan Aruch and the Poskim, guide him to do. But the chametz is transferring reshuyos, like the Shulchan Aruch says, and like the Chometz Hadeshin says, and it's a proper full-blown mechira, meaning you have something that you need to sell. The guy comes and picks it up from your house. You make this transfer, and I'd rather you have a good relationship with him, and you know that he's going to bring it back. But it's a full-blown sale that's happening on a one-to-one individual basis. Still nothing close to the wholesale style mechiras chametzin that we do today. Now, so let's get to the next plank. Now, in Europe, in the I think 15 and 1600s, there was famous laws that were passed where the government took over all control of alcohol production in those areas, in Congress Poland, I believe it is, and maybe later in some other areas. And then the government would I think it was called propination laws, maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong, and then they had something called an arrendador and arrendador, I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce these words, where they would lease out, production to people who would produce the alcohol in various different vicinities, and then they would sell them through a network of, inns and taverns, and that's how the business was ran. Now, as we know from many, many stories of all sorts of varieties, Chassidish Maisis, un-Chassidish Maisis, oftentimes the middlemen, the ones who would get the contract to produce the alcohol on behalf of the legal authorities, were Jews, who would run the taverns and the inns throughout, that crisscross these locales. And this arrangement contributed to a large amount of alcoholism in the population, of Poland and Lithuania and those areas. And it also contributed to a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism, because oftentimes the Jews were the ones, who were the tip of the spear in the misfortune and the gambling debts and the alcohol debts and the, Stam in general spiraling lifestyle of a peasant in those days. And therefore it contributed a lot to anti-Semitism. But this was the reality, and many books have been written, many stories have been told about these circumstances with the pirates and the mashke and all these are famous stories. Now, the problem is that this created a whole new set of mechiras chametz shaylas, because now there were Jews who owned copious amounts of chametz. Now you could have Jews who were sitting on stash, a large stash of. From what I could tell, I tried to look it up a little bit. It seems that the primary drink that they drank in these areas was rye, not vodka. I don't know in all the stories it's vodka, but it seems it was rye, and Jews could hold a tremendous stash in this type of chametz that they had in their shops, and they could not afford to give up all this. They'd lose all their parnasa. Not only that, but legally the overseeing government bodies would not allow them to throw away so much alcohol. And the shaila arose what to do about all this alcohol. Now, so A, there was much more chametz that needed to be sold, and B, besides that, there was another problem, is that it's all nice and good when you sell a few loaves of bread or some personal chametz to a non-Jew as your neighbor. You're relatively certain that he has no reason to keep it, and when Pesach is over, he's going to return it to you. But if you sell some peasant who lives near you vast amount of alcohol, and he knows that, like we saw in the Chometz or Rabbeinu Yerucham, you're going to have to explain to him that this is Mechira l'chalutin, it's a proper Mechira, even though you intend to come back for it, but it's a proper Mechira, the odds of him returning it to you, drop precipitously. And because of that, the Jews who were in this predicament were faced with a very new problem. Now, to address that, the Bach, who was one of the Gedolei HaPoskim of all time, but from the Gedolei Hadar at the time in Poland, the Bach was a prominent, although somewhat unsuccessful Rav. He had in his career 10 shtelers. Now, some of them, were Mailim B'Kodesh, but many of them he was thrown out of. Actually, I think we spoke in the past. The Bach was Rav in Bells. He was thrown out of Bells, and he cursed them on the way out that it would be muddy and they wouldn't have arable water. There's certain minhagim that the Belzer Shtat, the Sar Shalom, was makbid on, like out the Ershte Belzer Rav. When they would call the Sar Shalom the Ershte Belzer Rav, he would protest the Belzer Rav. He'd protest the Bach's the Belzer Rav. The Bach was a Rav in Brisk, and many towns between Bells to Brisk, but many towns in between with the Bach, towns and cities with the Bach was a Rav, and the Bach, who was well attuned to the needs and the shilas of the populace, was the one to address the shaila. And in his pirush on the Torah in Simtaf Ches, he takes on this shaila, and he innovates, and he says as follows: he says, "B'Medina zu, sheroiv maso matan hu b'yayin saraf." Most of the parnasa that's going on over here, most of the business is with yayin saraf, with alcohol, with hard alcohol. V'yafshel lahem l'machram l'goy michutz l'bayis mifrat l'machzikin be'aranda, which is the arentador that we're talking about. Yesh lahata b'inyin zeh sheyimker l'goy kol ha'chametz shebecheder v'gam ha'chad atzmi yimker l'goy ayin sham. I'm sorry, l'goy oid. So the Bach writes that Hayos, most of the business, and there's a big predicament, a major financial predicament that these people are faced with over here. So the Bach he creates a new innovation, and he allows them to sell all of this chametz to the non-Jews. But what he adds over here is that sheyimker chala chametz shebecheder v'gam ha'cheder atzmai. So you leave the room, the chametz stays exactly where it is, in the Jews' possession, in the Jews' control, so that it's not at risk of being lost. And you just transfer the entire area that it's on. You sell the room that it's in, and the guy will be kind of agav that. Now, the Bach is a shleimistic piece. He brings the Tosefta, he brings the Rabbeinu Yerucham, he quotes what the Chometz Hadeshen, he brings the Chalkim, obviously, and then he brings this innovation. But he says, "Miu tzarach limser l'goy," and this is a chumrah that the Bach has that to some degree is still adhered to today. He says, "Miu tzarach limser l'goy gam ha'maftech." You have to give over the key. Dim loy ken, if you don't give over the key. Given the Das Yisrael lachs of liknas chametz zachar Pesach, since the Yisrael plans on going back to be kind of achar Pesach, havale kemaskir beisei v'gamru Pesach adam and v'yigimel maftech v'yad asayich b'lo yidalad asayich livik, and he addresses an issue. Now, what the Bach is being machmer about over here is that when you sell this room to the non-Jew so that he could be in control of the chametz, the Bach is machmer that you do have to give him the key. You have to give him the key to. Now, Lemaisa later on, Paiskim the Magen Avram and the Taz Afanart and Simtaf Ches and the Mishabura himself later on is much more makel about this, and is not machmer that you have to give over the key. He has to have some way of knowing about the information or how to access it, but he doesn't have to actually give over the key. Now, what's interesting is that because this is primarily Eastern European problem that the Bach is solving, what's interesting is that here is where the path diverges from the between the Sfardim and the Ashkenazim. In the Ashkenazic world, it became more and more prevalent as the years transpired, and we'll see how this continues building to get to where we're getting today. It became more and more prevalent to institutionalize and to standardize the Mechiras Chometz, because it was something that everybody, or close to everybody, was engaging in. But in the Sephardic Kehillas, and Turkish lands, and other areas, Moroccan, etc., the idea of selling your Chometz to a non-Jew was still something that was mamish a once-in-a-while type of thing. Of course, they knew the Shulchan Aruch says it could be done, but it wasn't a very common practice until the Sfardim came to Eretz Yisrael. I think I could be wrong, but from what I can tell from looking at the Poskim, I think I saw a tshuva from Rabbi Tzion Abishol and Orlitzin and Chelik Gimel. He in Perek Tes he writes as follows: says Hine b'deris kaidmim lo yehu minig etzel b'nei Sfard shekol hakila tisnai glasses mechiras chametz. Not that it couldn't exist, meaning it just wasn't the prevalent minig that everybody in the kila would sell their chametz. K'vishanagu came b'nei Ashkenaz, like the b'nei Ashkenaz were noig. Just a handful of people, a smattering of people. Whoever it was that was highly invested would sell it. He says recently, today everybody already does it. They make the Bezdin a shliach, which is what we do today. We're marsha, the Rav, the Bezdin with the Kinyan, to be our to do it on our behalf, on our behest, and he does the mechir. And they're even makel not to give over the mafteach anymore. So this is the where the path diverges. The Bach, who's responding to a uniquely Eastern European conundrum that opened up the need and the viability of a Mechiras Chometz, is instituting in a way that made it much easier to do it, because now you don't have to transfer the chametz anymore. You can just keep the chametz in your house and sell the rishos. He's allowing you that, and later poskim come and layer onto that the Yeshua Yaakov and the Masas Binyamin. We can't go through each tshuva, the Machzas Shekel, the Magen Avram, the Taz, and if you look, if you want to see, so look into Taf Ches and the Nesekel, the Shari Tshuva and the Mishnah and etc., and you see all the how all of these poskim, some with more misgivings than others, some with various chumras, layered on, piled onto the idea of Mechiras Chometz Lakal, and they started allowing it. Now, the truth is that because of all this, all these various layers, our Mechiras Chometz in today, and hopefully we'll get to this, it will take us some time, but hopefully we'll get to this, is a construct that is much more complex and layered and has so many different kinyanim and chumras that are built into it because of so many of the Gedolei HaPoskim that participated in crafting it. Meaning it's not something that's just like a one-off. It's something that was built and crafted by many Gedolei Yisrael throughout the Deiros, and therefore it's comprised of so many chumras today, which hopefully we'll get to. Rabbi Shtermuch in the new Yom Tov Svarim, the Chuvas Van Haggis, the new one, he has a whole kuntris on the proper Shtar Mechirin, etc. Now, up until now, we're still in the Bach's world, still talking about a one-on-one individual selling their chametz to a non-Jew. The Bach just innovated to make it easier that you don't have to actually transfer the chametz from Rishos to Rishos, and now, the Bach made it easier to sell. Now, that's still not the way we do it. So now there's another layer that we have to add on. The selling with a shtar. Now, selling with a shtar is still not something the Bach's not talking about. The Mechiras Yaakov is not talking about the Shvus Yaakov, the Mechiras Yaakov, the Masas Binyamin, and all the early chuvas that talk about it are still not talking about selling with a shtar. So now, selling with a shtar is something that it's hard to put an exact finger of where that happened, but the Chassam Sofer in a very famous tshuva in Simon Kufid Gimel that we opened up with talks about it again, and I want to go back there. Now the truth is that he's not, the Chassam Sofer is not the only one or the first one to talk about it, but he's a good source that discusses. So now the Chassam Sofer's tshuva starts off is like this. It's a shayla that he's being asked about the fact as follows. He says, Asher nedarti eshalema, latzis mi mechteves hagasal l'sei the dina Mechiras Yisrael, l'nachli natzim eser chametz eser melach Shabbos l'chadema. He says, Hinezal, and he brings the mechilta batechem li'chametz, and what he's really addressing is the idea that the Mechiras Chometz that people do seems to be haramadik, it seems to be very shoddy and shallow, and he's going to show this. He brings a bunch of rayas, first of all, of certain things that exist that work with haramadik kinyanim. And I saw the Rabbi Weiss in his Chuvas and Chelik Beis, he has a whole collection of kinyanim that work mitzad halacha that are like shvache kinyanim, ayin sham. I forgot which, maybe Tshuva Lamed Tes, I forgot what Tshuva it is. But the Chassam Sofer brings the Tosefta of Yisrael v'Nachi v'Sfina, Chometz, then he brings the idea of Bavachli Aram, the Bahag's Gears of Bavachli Aram, and then he brings Rabbeinu Rucham. It says, Einim Even Devir Bahag, the Ashar Lit in the Good Matan of Nachzer of Lakha, he brings Rabbeinu Rucham's version that says, Bavachli Aram means, the Kamahanish Lit in the Leil Tanai, sell it properly. So Kavanasim Mavori says, the Haramas Mechir Zu had to come in a Torah Belishom Pikbook. He says it's mavur from the Rabbeinu Rucham that this mechira is heter gamim min atayr b'lishom pikbuk. It's totally on solid ground and it's fully acceptable. Even though both parties over here, the buyer and the seller, are very aware of the fact that they want to return this after Pesach, now it's sold. The lekeach could really do whatever he wants with it. It's a complete sale. It's just that because of the relationship, because of the friendly, cordial relationship they have with each other, is why he's not doing that. And he's saving it for his fellow to sell it back to them after Pesach. The Chayzer Machli Yisrael had to go bli pikbook. Then he continues on and he says, he brings another raya, Kasav Rabbeinu, Rambam, the Pirush Mishnah, Reish Paraketz and Ma'armim, Kol harama shel heter umirma shel isra and shamvish b'kavish hasacham. He brings examples of harama. And then the Chometz has this famous line. He says that here he brings this Valpiza, and here's where you see the evolution or the development of the stars. It's Valpiza. After a longer riches, Valpiza nagu b'chol tvutzas Yisrael limkar Chometz lenachri amakiroi machzira achar Pesach. They were knowing in all tvutzas Yisrael to sell the Chometz to Nachri amakiroi who returns it to you after Pesach. Ach yimkarenu kedinoi, sell it properly kedin. Hainu b'nesinas kasef u'mashicha lebeisei mamish. Fine. That's what he says. You sell it as long as you do it properly, it works. And then he says as follows: Ubefaftam hitvis merenu v'rabbeinu hagoyin bal hafla zatzal nusach shtar b'lashon hakodesh. In Frankfurt, the Hafla, who was the early Rebbe of the Chometz Sefer, published a shtar in lashon kodesh, like a blank, a shtar blank that everyone could use. V'achrav merenu harav Nasan Adler, Katz Atzal, his Rebbe of Nasan Adler, the Kohen, B'shinoi, v'hu nitfas b'sefer Kuntrus Hasma, Anita Kanti Ashtar B'lashon Ashkenaz, B'tfos Ayidei Rav Ber Frank, B'sei Dargada Bevin. I myself, the Chometz Sefer says, I wrote my own version, Ubezdin Tzedek, the Prague, Teknu Ktas B'nus Sachacha, v'nitfas Dargada the Prague, and the Prague Bezdin under the auspices of Shmuel Landau, and this is published in his Shuvas Shivas Tzion and Siman Yud, and over there he says that this is based on the Hadracha from his father, the Noda B'Yehuda, the Rav of Prague, that they published their version of the shtar. So you see that in the 1700s, heading into the 1800s, there becomes a propensity of, not a propensity, but there's just you see many different gedolim and rabbanim and practical rabbanim of various cities throughout Europe who are producing shtar templates, document templates, blanks that people could copy and use to sell their chametz. Now here's an interesting line. The Chometz Sefer says, "V'chol apin shavin amechiri gemurahi." And this is like the punchline of the tshuva. So whatever says, Chalap in all these different versions, the Aflar of Nasan Adler, myself, the Prague Bezdin, it's all minor shinuyim that are not mishana. They're all fully viable and kosher kinyanim that work. And v'chala mefakvik, and anybody's mefakvik in the mechira, roy ligara should be yelled at. Meaning you're maching on a minig that's okay. That's signed and sealed and gestempled by the Gedolei Yisrael throughout the Deiris, and it's a kosher minig. Then he continues on, and then eventually he circles back to that piece that we started with, where he brings from the Baruch Tam, the Yosef Dayan, Baruch Frankel, Abez and Leipnik, and he brings that story. So the Chometz Sefer is really samach yadav on the shtari mechira that exists, the common prevalence of the shtari mechira, and he's telling you that the Bezdin in Prague and Rav Nasan Adler and the Hafla additionally did it, and I'm sure there is, I know of, you could look this up, there are many, many different Shtari Mechira today. There's Shmuel, what's his name, of Shmuel Eliezer Stern from Bnei Brak, one of the Dayanim there, he put out a whole sefer called Mechiras Chometz Kel Chasei, all the various versions and variants of this, and Rav has his version. So today, we know, based on all these different shtaros that various Gedolim wrote, and they need minor changes here and there, there's all these shtaros. Now, somewhere after the Bach, it pivoted to the next layer of where there was a shtar that almost anybody could use. So now that made it even more accessible. The Bach made it accessible by saying you don't have to transfer, you can keep it in your rishos. But now, it became even more accessible by Gedolim publishing shtaris blanks that they could be in the back of Haggadah that anybody could copy and sell. Now, what's important to note is that at this point, through the Chometz Sefer's era, we're still talking about one-on-one. If you notice when we read the Chometz Sefer says, it's a one-on-one. It's a Jew who's selling the chametz to a non-Jew who knows him, who he trusts, who he's convinced will return the chametz after. But again, it's still a one-on-one, which inherently is some kind of stronger mechira. There's less harama there. It's one-to-one. They're making a sale. Now, granted, the sale is not going to be in perpetuity and it's going to come back, but it's a sale. It's a sale between two individuals. Now, what's interesting is that also there was something to notice in the Chometz Sefer. The Chometz Sefer talked about the different languages that these stars were written in. He wrote that some wrote in lashon hakodesh. Others wrote different. Now the Divrei Chaim in our Chaim and Chelik Beis in Tshuva, I think it's in Tshuva Lamed Zayin. He has a whole Tshuva describing. Here's the Shaila. I'll read you the Shaila. B'shtar mechiras chametz l'nachri hanichta b'lashon kodesh mahani machmas the din of the malchusa shloyoyel shum shtar hanichta b'lashon kodesh ha'ivris zulas b'lashon ashkenaz. The area where the Shaila is coming from, the law is that any legal document has to be written in German. It can't be written in lashon kodesh. So the Divrei Chaim wants to know, would a shtar that's written in lashon kodesh, which we saw the haflaz, for example, was in lashon kodesh, would that have veracity and halachic teeth? Now the Rechaim has a short tshuva to go through the inyanim of din malchus dina, how they're relevant over here, etc. And then in the end, he ends with this last paragraph. He says, what would be fadin to write in Lashon Ashkenaz? The Bnei Torah and even the regular landslide don't really know Lashon Ashkenaz. He says, although it is important to pay attention that the star should be accurate, Talmid Chacham has to write it. He says, I didn't write one set template. I gave instructions to many different people, and it has to be someone who knows what he's doing. He says, these Talmidei Chachamim, he says, the trade-off over here is not worth it. In order to have a proper star with the kinyanim right and everything's good, you have to have someone who's a Talmid Chacham, a Banafai Talmid Chacham, who knows what he's doing. Banafai Talmidei Chachamim, at least in our area, they don't understand Lashon Ashkenaz. So that's the trade-off. You want to have a good star, it has to be done by Talmid Chacham. It can't be done in Lashon Ashkenaz, he says. Then he makes reference to the story about his shver that the Chum Sefer mentions that we opened with. He says, don't make a change. My shver, the Baruch Tam, noag lichtlev ben Lashon Ashkenaz, was makbid to write it in Lashon Ashkenaz, and l'chayr we know why, because he was concerned that it should be a legally binding document according to the local laws, like we know from the way the Chum Sefer quotes the story. And therefore, the Rechaim, who was an Aiden by the Baruch Tam, at least from his first marriage, was making reference to Shver did Lashon Ashkenaz. Reisi, he says, I was there and I saw. It wasn't something that he was like super makbid on. It was a davar rafa. It was something that he he did, but it wasn't something that he was super makbid on. So the Rechaim says it doesn't have to be in Lashon Ashkenaz. But now this is all just to highlight the fact the streamlining and the template creating of Mechiras Chometz. Now, with this we arrive, let's call it, to the early 1800s, and we've already built ourselves up from almost no reference to Mechiras Chometz in the Gemara and Pesachim, although there is a few references, but they're not talking about doing it as a general practice. It's more talking about mamash, like an emergency or something that happened, and when the transfer takes place, and etc. So we're not really going to go into that, although maybe next week there is a very cute chap from Shlomo Kluger to try to find the Makar from a Gemara and Pesachim. So maybe we'll we're on the Gimel. Maybe we'll talk about that for a minute. But we went from the vague and obscure backgrounds, origins of Mechiras Chometz, all the way charting its transmission from the Tosefta and the Yerushalmi through the Ga'inim, the Bahag's Girsa, Rabbeinu Amram, the Rishonim's Machlekes, the Ritva, the Rabbeinu Yerucham, the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, the Bach's innovation that allowed you to leave it in your house, his Chumrah that you have to have the key, give the key to the guy, the person that later took that away, and then the creation of Shtaris that standardized it further. Now, all this gets us to close to the point of our Mechiras Chometz, but still not all the way there, because our Mechiras Chometz are not a one-on-one basis. They're not to someone who we know. It's something that's a very generalized, procedure in the entire Lakewood, where I don't know, tens of thousands of households are selling their chametz. It's a handful of actual transactions that are happening at the end of the day. Most of the transactions that are happening are just kinyanim for Harsha, to allow your local rav with the bezdin to effectuate the sale on your behalf. But ultimately, they pull together all these documents, and it transpires in a few transactions with a few select non-Jews and a few select Batidinim and Rabbanim. Now, that system of like the communal general Mechiras Chometz, that is still yet a later innovation. And I think we'll stop with this, and Mitzvah will continue with that innovation, which is something we touched on briefly in the past, but we'll go to it more in detail. And then if we have time before Pesach still, we'll go into the actual modern Mechiras Chometz, the real, nuts and bolts of it, and just try to show, how each piece of it, all the chumras, where they're built from, and the origins of it. Okay, so Mitzvah we'll try to continue this topic.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.